Hello, my name is Ian Watson, and I am the Executive Director of the American Membrane Technology Association, otherwise known as AMTA. The interview you're about to see is one in a series of what we call Chats with the Pioneers. AMTA is a technical association that is founded on the advocacy of the use of membrane technology from wastewater reclamation to seawater desalination. The heart of this technology is the membrane itself. About 2.5 years ago, our board of directors decided that to preserve the history of this technology, that we should talk to some of the pioneers in the industry who started down the road of commercializing these processes. And that's the purpose of these interviews. Our intent, AMTA's intent, is to make these segments available on our website for viewing by our membership and others, so that the next generation of engineers and scientists can understand the efforts of those who helped solve some of the world's water problems today. Today, we are joined by two people who worked for a company called Ionics. Ionics was arguably the first membrane company in the United States to be involved in the process of desalting. To my right is Mr. Eugene Reahl, who joined the company around 1980 or 81. And to my immediate right is Mr. Henry or Hank Valcour, who was at Ionics for many, many years until his retirement. Hank, could you tell us a little bit about the founding fathers of Ionics?
Sure. Basically, there were 3 MIT grads, Bill Kirkham, Wayne McRae, and Tom Kirkham, and Bill Katz. And I believe they had been working on ion exchange membranes while they were at MIT, and they came out and formed a company. I believe it was in like 1949 or something like that. And the chairman of the board was Professor Gilliland, who was then head of the chem engineering at MIT.
In your discussions with these people, did you ever ask them why they thought there might be a future in ion exchange membranes?
I honestly don't remember. When I joined Ionics, they were looking for a field engineer, and I had been working for Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding. They were not doing too well, so I took a job. They advertised for a chemical engineer, but my degree is in marine engineering. I joined, and they got me ready and sent me off to the field. Yeah. So I didn't have time to get into discussions like that.
You sort of came in the door, got hired, and left.
Yeah.
Gene, how about you? How did you come to be involved in Ionics, and were you in the water treatment business before that?
No, actually I wasn't. I came out of the aerospace industry in the late 70s and worked on the space shuttle and satellite programs, and ran a small industrial company and heard more and more about desalination. It was mostly reverse osmosis. And I found out about Ionics looking for a position, somebody to be the Western Regional Sales Manager, when I was living in California at the time. And I got together with Ionics because it seemed like a very interesting company. A lot of technical gurus running around, which of course as an engineer I liked. And they trusted me to be on my own out in California. And I started covering all of the islands in the Pacific and the entire western U.S. as far east as the Mississippi River. And to elaborate a little bit further on what Henry was saying, was the original president of Ionics, the MIT head of chemical engineering department, was also a science advisor to President Kennedy. And those were the kinds of people, when I joined the company, they were still there. I came in at the very end of that early initial starting phase, and it was a marvelous outfit to work for. Everybody was an MIT graduate engineer, like MIT was a local school, including Henry. Henry's an MIT graduate. And I started off on my own, and I later wrote a paper about a little bit of the history of Ionics, and the company was formed like 1948, 1949, and the financing for the company came from a retired honorary general, General Dorio, who started a company called American Research. And he started the company after World War II to give returning GIs a spiff, a heads-up seed money to start companies. And one of the companies, in addition to Ionics, that General Dorio started was Digital, the computer company. So by the time he retired, there were like 70 or 80 major worldwide companies that had been founded with money that General Dorio had put out. He saw the vision of it. And back in about 1952, there was an article in the New York Times about this small company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that was going to reinvent the world with a process called electrodialysis. And they said you could desalt seawater for 10 cents a gallon. Well, of course, it didn't quite work out that way, but Ionics got involved, and Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, was the first one to buy a unit back about 1954. In fact, Ionics didn't even have the money to build the system, so Aramco took a chance and said, here's the money, build it and ship it to Saudi Arabia. And that's how it started.
That's how it got started. That's interesting. You say you started at Bethlehem Shipbuilding?
Yes.
So how long were you there?
After I graduated from MIT, I had to join the Navy to fulfill my obligations. And when I came out, I worked for Bethlehem Steel, probably for a year and a half, 2 years, at the Quincy Shipyard in Massachusetts.
So when you responded to Ionics' call for field engineers, tell us what happened then.
Well, I think the only reason they hired me was I was an MIT grad, even though I wasn't a chemical engineer. It goes along with Gene said. I spent the first several weeks at Ionics, then in Cambridge, deriving the equations that you use to set an electrodialysis plant in operation. And I mention that because we didn't have computers at that time. We had, if you were lucky, you had a little plus or minus divide calculator. But it gave me a really deep understanding of how electrodialysis works. When I went out on my first field engineering job, I had a slide rule with me, field kit to do a rough water analysis. And to do that, and I'd sit down and figure out what the voltage and the amps were going to be and what the percent salt removal will be. Where later on, this was all computerized, and it just made it easier for the guys.
What were the challenges, I guess you'd call them, of taking what was a relatively small startup company and building what was fairly sophisticated equipment? Did Ionics do that? Did Bill Katz and Wayne and Tom do that themselves, or did they have a shop where this was built by somebody else? Or?
First of all, in the early days, back in the late 50s and early 60s, a lot of the Ionics business was selling small ED plants in North Africa and the Middle East for oil companies and others that were desperate to make some drinkable water out of brackish water. But I have a feeling that one of the big moves that made Ionics was when they developed electrodialysis reversal. I don't know if you want me to get too technical.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that.
How it works, but we started out, there was the guys in the research group at Ionics played around with reversing polarity. And what it meant was you could operate electrodialysis without chemical feed. And it also allowed it to run without getting fouled very quickly.
Right.
And I had the opportunity of field testing some of the first EDR units.
And when was that?
In the 62, 63, 64, somewheres in there.
So it was a fairly early development in the history of Ionics.
Yeah. The first approach was to sell them as home units in parts of the country, U.S., where people were living with brackish water. But what it built into was a whole line of equipment called aquamites that Ionics had. The first units would make, the little ones I'm talking that we tested was like 300 gallons a day. But Ionics grew with these aquamites up to units that would put out 1 million gallons a day. And then I think that was a big step in their marketability.
Yeah, I think one of the, and as you know, and Gene knows, I used to be a general manager of the Island Water Association in Sanibel.
I remember.
And we had an early Ionics plant, which was built, as I recall, around 1972 or 3.
I think so.
And I went there in 1977. And it was not a reversal plant.
No.
And I can remember listening to my operators complain vehemently about having to unbill the stacks periodically. And we had a fairly nasty groundwater with hydrogen sulfide and stuff in it. Unbill the stacks and literally scrubbing the membranes to get the slime and everything else off of them, putting them back together. And of course, if you put them back together, I think we had, you probably know better than I do, but I think we had maybe 420 cell pairs or something like that.
In that order of magnitude.
In those early stacks.
That means there was 1,200 individual pieces.
That's right. And if you put one back wrong, you had to take it apart and start all over again. And I think your point about reversal is well taken, because that eliminated a large part, not totally, but a large part of that routine maintenance chore.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the big things about ED was that, as you're discussing, the unit was pretty much indestructible. People in Saudi Arabia who didn't want to pay attention to anything could totally follow the membrane stack with salts, but there were people who literally took the stacks apart and used sandpaper to sand the salts off the membranes. And if you look at the early days of RO, when it was cellulose acetate membranes, and probably really not commercialized, but by 1969, Ionics had sold 208 ED units around the world, most of the sales being in the Middle East and North Africa.
Right.
I think the first sale in the United States was like 1958 in a small town in California, and then a couple in Texas and here and there. But when EDR came, and EDR got commercialized about 1974, when that came about, and the DC field and the membrane stack would switch itself automatically, the stack would go into reverse, clean itself out. That's when EDR really took off.
Yeah. I think the first plant in Florida, in fact, it was one of the first brackish water desalting plants in Florida, was at Siesta Key.
Siesta Key, yes.
And that went in before Sanibel by 2 or 3 years, I think.
I think so.
And that operated for quite a while, and then eventually was replaced. And then subsequently there was one, I don't know if you remember, you won't remember them probably, but there was a guy in Sarasota called C.E. Pitts Jr., who bought a small machine and operated it successfully in a development. This was a privately owned housing development for many, many years. And he was one of the, shall we say, more aggressive membrane cleaners. I have a story about him. I was at his place one day, and he had also bought an RO unit from Fluid Systems. And he had an 8-inch spiral wound element unrolled on the floor of the plant.
Wow.
And he was trying to clean it exactly the same way he had cleaned the EDR membranes, which wasn't. He never did get it rolled back up into an 8-inch format. Just wouldn't go.
Now there's a 12 million gallon a day plant in Sarasota with the county.
That's right. Well, I worked on that. I worked on that project.
Yeah. That was built in the early 90s.
Yeah, and Ed Geishacker, and we actually are currently in the process of rebuilding that plant with Mark IV system. Completely, yeah. So you started with the small units. What was the size of the membrane?
The very first, what eventually became an Aquamite 1, the membranes were like 9 by 12 inches.
And the unit was like the size of a washing machine.
Yeah,
that's what it looked like.
And you use those a lot for pilot testing, as I recall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We did a market test in Ventura, California And they built, I think it was like 50 of these units, and they did look like little washing machines. And we didn't sell a one. But they were then used, as you just mentioned, for pilot units.
I guess it was in the 60s or maybe the early 70s. There was a demonstration plant in Webster, South Dakota. Were you involved in that, Hank?
No, but you want me to give you my take on that?
Yes, please.
And it kind of describes Ionics. Ionics, when they started, had the ED process pretty well locked down with patents. When the Office of Saline Water started promoting demonstration plants, when they got to looking at ED, Ionics wasn't willing to open their patents, which was a requirement of OSW. So they went to the Japanese and they put in an Asahi ED plant. And that's why Ionics didn't get the demonstration plant.
But it was, Asahi never did anything after that. In the U.S., they tried a couple of times.
They tried, yes.
Well, their plants were mostly intended to take salt out of seawater to concentrate salt and not make a usable product.
Right.
So Ionics and Asahi were on the different ends of the spectrum.
Right.
We made product, they wanted to make salt, and it didn't quite work.
Was there any other, I don't think, and you would know better than I, probably Eugene would know better than I, was there any competitors in the United States at that time?
I don't believe so.
Asahi was the only one who had tried, and they tried several times, but the systems didn't work because there was no field service support, and it wasn't, again, the technology was developed to make salt from seawater and not make a usable product.
Right.
The Russians and the South Africans had played with or looked at and tried to develop electrodialysis. And I believe the South Africans actually built a few plants in South Africa.
Yeah, there was some, I did a World Bank project years ago and visited several ED operations, small ED plants in Uzbekistan, which were Russian, and this was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the only place they could get spare parts was from the Russians, and the Russians were essentially holding them to ransom. So I suggested they contact Ionics just in case that there was some way that Ionics could work with them, because they were really desperate. But they were a testament to the ruggedness of the technology, because those things were running without instrumentation, rust all over the place, salt crystals hanging down the side of the stacks, and they were still making water. It was Russian water, but it was still water. So, Gene, you and I met probably 30-odd years ago.
That's about right.
And you spent pretty much all your time out in the western United States.
Everything west of the Mississippi River. A lot of time in Texas, New Mexico, some time in Colorado. And then as Ionics continued to grow, I moved more towards the West Coast when another fellow came in and did Texas. But I figured out one day that I probably sold something like 120 EDR units in the almost 30 years before I retired 2.5 years ago.
And who were your customers?
Early on, a lot of industrial accounts. That was, again, when I first joined Ionics, RO wasn't as well perfected as it got to be later. So a lot of ED units went into some power plants for pre-demineralization in front of ion exchange demineralizers, carbon black plants, oil refineries, and a lot of municipal applications. And the municipal business continued to grow. Did a lot of work with the military. In fact, right now there's a job that will go into a very, very remote Army base in California. It'll be a 6 million gallon a day plant. We did a job in Utah, which was funny because it took me 18 years to sell the plant. But finally, when arsenic requirements came in, EDR was very good at removing arsenic and perchlorate and chlorides, all with a very high level of silica in the feed water. And that was why we did so well in Hawaii. There was a unit I sold in Napa Valley in California at a hotel that had about 125 ppm of silica coming in the feed water. Some of it was colloidal, and with a little bit of fine tuning on some filters in front, the EDR ran fine. So That was EDR's forte, was to get in very difficult, very problematic waters, and the unit would just run once people got used to handling the system.
Yeah, I think that's if you look back at the history of the competition between ionics and the RO world, initially ionics tried to take them head on,
Right.
and that didn't turn out to be very successful,
That's correct.
particularly as the RO membranes improved.
Once thin film composite membranes
Right.
came out, yeah.
But then, there are certain places, like Sarasota County, where the limitations on solubility of calcium sulfate, in this case in Sarasota County, actually pointed, it was relatively low TDS water, but high in calcium sulfate. And it was tailor-made for ED, or for EDR by then.
The issue with EDR too was people needed high water recovery.
Right.
And there's a plant, for example, in Virginia, Suffolk, Virginia, which was expanded to be about 13 million gallons a day, and it runs at 94% water
Right.
recovery.
Right.
That was EDR's forte, run on waters that are very difficult to handle, especially with elevated levels of silica, and where you had to push water recovery to the maximum to minimize brine disposal. That's
And
where
the,
EDR...
and the Suffolk plant is, I think, an interesting. I'm glad you raised that particular facility, because EDR was selected by the operators in preference to RO, but it was selected in head-to-head competition, which I must admit surprised me. But they've always operated the plant very well, and
The funny thing too about a lot of EDR customers is they buy another one because when they get used to operating it, they just say, no, we want to keep going with it.
Right. So when RO finally came along, particularly the film, there was some competition in the CA days, but you could make a case, probably from your point of view, from the ionics perspective, you could make a case about selecting EDR. When TFC came along, thin film composite RO membranes, that made your arguments a little less powerful, I would think.
The recovery still was the issue, but
Yes, the recoveries are still an issue. But how did you, on your side, approach that challenge? What were your strategies for dealing with this upstart technology?
What we had to do was, especially on municipal jobs where the customers were going to go out and get revenue bonds to be paid back over a 20-year period of time, we would have people look at the long-term cost of the plant, not only capital cost for the equipment and the building, but the long-term O&M cost. And that's where on applications, particularly where the feed waters were less than, say, 12 or 1,300 ppm, EDR would have a significantly lower O&M cost. In fact, there are a lot of plants, ED plants, where after 10 years, they've only replaced about 5-6% of the membranes. So if people took a long-term on an O&M basis, and then ionics would guarantee the O&M cost. If membranes would fail, we'd give them the membranes free. So based on long-term O&M and wrapping up a 20-year present worth analysis, that's how EDR could win. But it got more and more difficult, particularly with chemical improvements also with RO.
Right. Hank, you spent a lot of time overseas.
Yes.
And how did ionics deal with that aspect of the marketplace? I mean, you were operating in places like Libya and so on, where operator skill levels weren't particularly high, I would think. So,
in the 60s, a good deal of ionics business was, in fact, there was 1 year, I believe, that like 90% of the revenues came from Libya. And these were plants that were at oil field camps out in the desert. I remember going to, and that was just when RO was starting to sell equipment to some of these locations. I remember going one time to a plant, an RO plant at some oil camp, I forget what company it was, and there was a big pile of RO membrane modules sitting. And the little ED plants and EDR plants just didn't have that problem. But of course, the RO field developed and they started understanding what you had to do and what the limits were. And and what caused fouling or scaling. And so, you know, it was a slide. I mean, it was something you could, eventually got to the point where, you know, RO made sense. Let me mention one case. This doesn't. One of the most exciting jobs I did in Libya was helping to install and start up a plant that was treating 35,000 ppm brackish well water. The water came out of the ground at super saturated in hydrogen sulfide and saturated in calcium sulfate. In this particular camp, oil gathering center was like 200 kilometers in from the coast. At least two other companies, not RO companies to be fair, but had tried, and there was pieces of equipment there with big heavy layers of scale, 2 or 3 inches thick. And this was actually an Ionics ED batch plant that ran successfully, was eventually, after my time, changed to a EDR plant. But so there are these particular spots where one system works better than the other. I don't think RO would have had a chance on that plant.
Right. The development of the membrane itself, the ion exchange membrane, over the years that improved in terms of its electrical efficiency and so on. Did you ever think, or did the management of Ionics ever think that there was a limit to how far you could go with that? You know, at some point, you know, it would be so thin and such a good.
Perhaps, but it wasn't so much making the membranes thin. It was tailoring membranes that had a different transfer capability. You know, ED works by the ions passing through the membrane from one side to the other.
Right.
And you're dealing with monovalent ions and divalent ions. They made special membranes to treat cheese whey, to desalt cheese whey. So I think there was a lot of development along those lines. I've been away from Ionics now for almost 15 years, so I'm not sure what's going on with development, but I suspect they're still looking at ways of improving the membrane.
Yeah, but even at Sanibel, we used to get periodically, we'd get a call, they wanted to bring some
new type
membranes down and put them in one stack, or new spacer designs, or...
Probably one of the biggest changes in the membranes that were made is, as you know, there were cation membranes and anion membranes. And in the early 80s, Ionics changed the chemical formulation of the anion membranes to take out the benzene rings, and those membranes became a lot more reliable in terms of less fouling, better chemical cleaning. But the other thing that went hand in hand with membrane development was the constant improvement of spacers. Because the spacers are what give you the turbulent flow that mixes because you don't have much of a layer of water in between the surface of two membranes, but as you put a better spacer in that gives more turbulence with less pressure drop, the turbulence mixes the ions around and you get better salt removal. So there's been a constant development of both, more than that lately, the last 20 years, of spacer development than membrane development. And the newest EDR units, what they call the Mark IV stacks, now have what looks like a window screen spacer.
Right.
These spacers used to force the water to go along a flow path, wiggle back and forth, and would have turbulence induced by little cross straps. Now they use a spacer that looks like a window screen, and it's more of a wash flow action. And because the pressure drops have come down, you can push more water through a membrane stack. And because you get better turbulent flow, you can remove more salt per stage. So instead of having maybe 3 membrane stacks in series where you get sequential salt removals, now you just have 2 stages because you can rip more salt out of the water.
Yeah, in fact, in Sarasota, we will be going to a 2-stage system to replace what was originally a 4-stage system.
Right.
So it's quite a change. What as RO came a stronger and stronger competitor, at some point, and I can remember discussions in Dick Smith's newspaper, about RO versus ED and EDR, and it was a pitch battle. Bill Katz had his say, and then Herb Sligo would have his say, and so on and so forth. And at some point, it's kind of like Permacep's experience in previous interviews. At some point they decided perhaps they should be in the spiral business instead of the hollow fiber business, or perhaps both. At some point, Ionics must have made the decision that, well, shucks, we don't like RO, but we're going to have to get involved.
Absolutely. There was finally that recognition that it's a system that's here. And one thing that comes to mind, Gene, is Ionics developed a thing called a triple membrane system.
Exactly.
Which incorporated not only EDR, but RO, and there was different configurations.
And it was ultrafiltration.
Ultrafiltrations, all packaged in one unit. In fact, a lot of that was applied for mobile units. We would put a system in a trailer, move the trailer pre-built to a site.
And that was mostly used in the electronics industry.
Electronics and power generation.
And nuclear power plants early on. That was about 1987, if I remember right. But 86 was the first triple membrane trailer.
Yeah.
But then in addition to that, Ionics started bidding projects that were only RO.
Correct. But that was after thin film composite membranes.
Oh, yes.
Even more, and you might talk to John Arnold when you talk to him, Ionics actually started making RO membranes in Watertown.
Their own?
Oh, yeah.
It was under license with some other company.
With Toray.
Yeah.
With Toray membrane, but we were...
Because after I left Ionics, I came back a couple of times to do some contract engineering work, and I got involved in the test facility for the new membrane production facility, where I forget if they tested every membrane module, but certain ones had to go through it.
Right.
But one of the first really big jobs Ionics did was they decided on a business model where we could own and operate desalination plants and sell water, and a seawater RO plant was built by Ionics on the Canary Islands back about 1988, 1989 time frame, and then came Santa Barbara, the seawater project in California. That was 1990. I got the contract. In 1992, that plant went online.
Right.
So by then, Ionics was pretty well committed, and we could go in and say to people, we can do either EDR or RO. We have no argument with either one. We just give you the best technology.
Now, did some of the old timers feel a little strange about being in the RO business?
I suspect. Can I give a story quickly about Greenfield, Iowa?
Yeah.
Was one of the first, I believe, municipal desalting plants on brackish water that went out to bid, and I believe Permuted, if I recollect correctly, had wined and dined the people there, and they were all ready to go. In the 11th hour, Bill Katz found out that there was an open bid. They had advertised the bid in the local newspaper, so it didn't get spread around too much. But we found out, and he and I, at that time I was working for Bill as a salesman. We got a plane and flew out to Des Moines or wherever it was and rushed to Greenfield. And we didn't have a chance. What we did for the city of Greenfield was Permuted reduced their price at the 11th hour, so there couldn't be any question they were going to get the job. But I say that as a story just to give you how anti-RO Ionics was at those days. But time went on and they finally embraced it.
I have a similar story that I have to tell you on the other side. When I left Hydronautics in the early 80s and went into the consulting business, one of my first clients was a guy called Austin McCormick, who built RO equipment down in Texas.
That's how I met you, through him, remember?
And he called me up one day and said, I need you to come down to Texas. There's a bid in Granbury,
Texas.
and they're going to buy an EDR plant. And he said, I don't think they should be buying an EDR plant. So he hired me as a gunslinger, I guess, to go down to Texas. And we went to Granbury, and you were there.
I was the guy selling the EDR.
You were there. You were the guy selling the EDR.
I remember that story.
And I stood up and extolled the virtues of RO. and sat down, and he took me out to dinner. And the next morning, I got a plane and went back to Florida. And Granbury became an EDI plant. So I guess my persuasive powers were less than yours, Gene.
Well, the honest truth was, though, I had never met you before, and I mostly saw the back of your head when you were standing up testifying, but you gave a pretty fair evaluation of both technologies. You actually told the truth, and then the folks in the town decided to... And the other funny part of that story is Bill Katz gave me an express order not to cut the price below a certain number, and I just went right below that with the EDR unit. When I got the order, he never said a word to me. He never said, you shouldn't have done that. He went, that's fine. You got
and
the order.
an EDR is still in operation there today. The Brazos River Authority still operates EDR down there. That came up later. The Brazos River plant came up later.
The BRA. I'm not sure what they're doing nowadays, but there was another EDR unit sold on the other side of Lake Granbury. In fact, I can't remember the guy's name, but we went down to Waco, Texas to meet with the Texas Water Authority because they kept telling that guy, you can't set water rates until you build the plant and prove what it costs to operate it. And he said, I can't get the money until so we convinced the state that we knew what we were doing and we could give him the operating cost. And they said, fine, go ahead. We'll give you the license to build the plant. And that EDR plant's still running. Yeah. It's like 1 million gallons a day on the other side of the lake.
That's right. We're talking about operating facilities still going along full steam. From the early days, what was the most significant plant that you were involved in, both of you? Let's start with Hank.
Must have been Buckeye, Arizona. Because that
1962.
That was the very first field job I went on as assistant field engineer to put in, I think it was a 6-stack straight ED plant. It had been preceded by a demonstration unit that we put in the main street in Buckeye next to a laundromat. There was a lot of aspects about that plant. One was, in fact, nothing to do with membranes, but the plant was all PVC piping, solvent welded. And that was back in the days when not too many people were solvent welding PVC pipe. And we put this whole plant together. The other field engineer who was in charge, Bill Park, God bless him, we put this whole plant together with a contractor. Finally got it finished. Let's put the water in it. 90% of the joints leaked. But anyway, we got over that and then got the plant running. And we were obligated to, I forget if it was a 30-day non-stop test. And we eventually did it. The two of us ran the test plant. We worked 12-hour shifts. But that's a memorable plant that I remember.
And Buckeye still uses...
They eventually, I forget how long that plant ran. It ran for quite a few years. Oh, I would guess 15 years maybe.
Yeah, it got replaced in 1987 when yours truly
there you go.
piggybacked on you and sold them 750,000 gallons a day worth of EDR in 1987.
Plant, right.
And that's still there?
No, it's been shut down because they built large regional RO plants out there now, and RO has replaced EDR.
Yeah.
Instead of the town doing its own thing, it's collecting water from a regional water provider.
Right. What about you, Gene? You were out there with the ranchers and the cowboys.
In terms of two things, in terms of RO, probably the biggest thing I worked on was the city of Santa Barbara plant. When I got a call from a guy in the city of Santa Barbara named Phil Overrender, or I called him and I said, I hear you're going out to bid a desalting plant. And I literally heard him smack his forehead because I had met with him. He said, I just put out 280 RFQs. And I never thought of you. And the windup is Ionics got a big contract for about a $40 million seawater RO plant because California was having a catastrophic drought in the early 1990s. Near Santa Barbara, there were 3 dams. The biggest one was Cachuma, and then 2 feeder dams. And the 2 feeder dams were totally dry. And Cachuma was down to like 17% of capacity. And Ionics did a 5-year project in 2 years. And then, of course, the plant only ran for 3 weeks because the drought was over. Yeah. So they paid us $1 million a month for 5 years, and then the plant is still there. The biggest EDR plant I did probably was making Suffolk, taking that to 13 million gallons a day, and Magna, Utah, a lot of bigger EDR plants. But probably the most fun I ever had was going to Hawaii. I used to fly to Hawaii on a Wednesday and get out of there on the red eye on Friday night, because I hated going to Hawaii, because all the happy married couples were there and all these pretty girls were working in restaurants, and I was walking around a single guy sucking my thumb, so I would go home. But each of the islands is its own independent county, and I was on Maui at a remote site up behind Lahaina, where this old German guy was building a castle. His name was Hans. And there was a 1 million gallon storage tank there, and I was going to get some samples and take a little collapsible water bottle and take the samples back and have Ionics analyze them. And my rep was Peter Hansen, a Dane who had moved to Hawaii in the early 60s, and Gordon Okazaki, who worked with the county, and Hans. And they're standing there, and I turn around, and I'm collecting a water sample, and I get this big, right in my bottom. I get hit, get lifted up off the ground, and I turn around, and there's Peter Hansen and Okazaki and Hans looking in the other direction, and there's a donkey standing right there. And I looked at them and I went, say something. Didn't talk to me. So I turned around again, and I'm taking another water sample, and I get nailed even harder this time. And I turned around as fast as I could, and there's the donkey about 6 feet from me going, hee-haw, hee-haw, hee-haw. That's why I said, all right, I'll fix your wagon. So I backed up to the water tower, looking at the donkey, filling the water sample bottle, when the papa and the baby came down. And now it was a little family, and I went over and I petted Mama, and I petted Papa, and Mama was like up to here on my shoulders, Papa was higher, and the little baby was about that high. And as I went over to pet the little one, each time I took a step closer, the little one would take a step backwards, and the mama donkey kept going, hee-haw, hee-haw, and I couldn't make up my mind whether she was telling me, keep your hands off my kid, or whether she was trying to say, hey, make friends, you can have fun with people. Yeah. But being headbutted by a donkey, that was probably the funniest thing I had done. But just a lot of the interesting things where there were bigger plants sold, a lot of the interesting things were the fights we had in the old days, anti-RO, and we would win them. But the battles were kind of comical in the end.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. What did you think about the decision to sell Ionics to GE?
To me, well, he had been retired. I was standing in the drugstore with my cell phone ringing in my pocket, and Ionics had struggled. The stock would go for, say, well, before we did Santa Barbara, the stock was selling for like $25 a share, and within 18 months of getting the Santa Barbara order, the stock was up to over $60 a share. And then it kind of came back down again, and we had some issues in the company, and the company was struggling, so the stock was down around $16 a share, back up to 20, up and down. We thought we'd get through. And then my phone rang in my pocket, and I'm in a drugstore, and my friend of mine calls up and says, did you just hear that GE's buying Ionics? I said, you're crazy. But it came out, GE was going to pay $40-some a share, and it was kind of a shock. And when GE bought us, because obviously things changed a lot, and the company kind of went, a lot of people went their own separate ways. But it was, the days of being in the pioneering business were over, because GE had a lot of its business disciplines that we had to fit into, Right. So I retired about 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, Hank, you must have had a different reaction when you heard the news, because you'd been there at the beginning, pretty much.
One of my thoughts was, it was interesting how GE purchased most of Ionics' competitors. At that time, near the final days of my final period of mine at Ionics, I was involved in selling ultra-pure water systems, primarily to nuclear power plants in the U.S. and a few overseas. That was all made up of portable units where you'd often do a provide and operate contract. And we had competitors, but in the end, GE bought up all the competitors. That's what struck me as being rather strange.
Yeah. So then we became bedfellows with people who used to basically be at each other's throats.
That's right.
And we'd have to sit across the table, and it all worked out in the end. You get along. You have the same common goals, Yeah.
We've always thought that Sarasota County was a pretty big plant at 12 MGD. I was amazed when I heard the news that Ionics was going to build a 50-plus MGD plant in Barcelona. What did you, I mean, you'd been on the inside. Surely you must have considered building big plants before.
Well, that was our Spanish brethren. You know, those guys over there, basically with Ionics Iberica, were kind of, bless their souls, independent operators doing a lot of things, selling a lot of EDRs in Spain, high silica water, Canary Islands, and they went out and said they could do these things. In fact, they built their own EDR systems. We just shipped them membrane stacks, and they would build everything else themselves in their own shop. But they actually went and they pilot tested an EDR system for over a year on a highly variable river water that got down to like 1 degree centigrade in the winter and would go up to 25 degrees centigrade in the summer. Enormous silica levels when the mountain runoff would come. Colloidal silica go up and down, and they proved that EDR would operate. And no matter how many qualified companies came in with RO, they just couldn't get RO to run. And they pulled off the contract. They got it. And 600 membrane stacks. It's a huge facility.
Yeah, it is.
Now the second biggest EDR plant in the U.S. is Suffolk at 13 MGD, and Sarasota is now the third largest plant
yeah.
at 12 MGD.
After you retired, did you do some consulting for Ionics or for other people?
I did. I immediately actually went to work for my town's DPW because there was a big 20-mile long tunnel being drilled underneath our town, part of the City of Boston water supply. There were remedial parts of the contract, which included 15,000 feet of water main, new water main installation in my town of Southborough, Massachusetts. And they hired me to be the, I don't know what you'd call me, clerk of the works, or to do it. But then, following that, I actually did a few things for Ionics. In fact, I think I might have mentioned it previously with they put in this RO membrane construction facility, and I got involved in that. A few other things, but I spend a lot of my time building furniture. No.
That's a good pastime.
Yeah, no, I enjoy it.
If you, looking back on your career, when you went to that initial interview at Ionics, if you had 20/20 hindsight now, would you have done it again?
I think so. You know, you wonder when you come to these avenues in life, should I go this way or that way? Because when I took the job at Ionics, it was a temporary measure. I was waiting to see what else I could do in the shipbuilding field, but one thing led to another.
Gene, what about you? You've been retired for how long now?
Just about 2.5 years. I work part-time,
You
but
work
not
part-time?
in the water business.
Oh, what do you do?
I work with a company that builds food production equipment and builds food processing plants. The corporate offices are here, but the manufacturing plants in Wisconsin and out in California. There's RO membranes involved for making cheese whey, and now we just built the plant where we're going to make whey powder in Wisconsin. It's going through its startup phases, and it's a crazy company. It's like what Ionics used to be in the old days. Like, why did we make that mistake? We should have thought about that in advance. So it's like going back 30 years ago. But hindsight, I'm glad I joined Ionics. There were other things I could have done, but they probably would have been more just strictly business-related discipline of running a business. But Ionics was a wonderful company. They said to me, just go do it, and we trust your judgment, whatever, and that's kind of how it was, and it all panned out well in the end. And
It's good.
when you look back at it, I'm like the donkey story. I mean, how many people can say they've been headbutted by a donkey in Hawaii and live to tell it? But I'm glad I did it.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for coming and
Thank you.
sharing some of your personal history with us and the history
Thanks for
of
inviting
Ionics.
us.
And
Thank
it's
you.
been a pleasure. And
It's nice seeing you again,
It's always
too.
great to see folks you haven't seen for a while.
Absolutely.
So, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
There are a couple of final questions I'd like to ask you. As I said in the beginning, the introduction, this is an ongoing series. We plan on continuing this until we've either exhausted candidates for interviews, or I drop dead, or Doug gives up, or something like that. But who else at Ionics, other than the people we've already contacted, do you think would be worthy of an interview? And a couple of names come to mind. Kay Kachadorian was there for a while, and there was a guy, he was the electrical engineer for a long time, and his name escapes me.
You mean Eddie Rojas? You're talking about designer or engineer?
This is the guy that built the electrical equipment.
It would have been Eddie Rojas, but there were people before him that have since passed on.
But what about Kay Kachadorian? Because he was there for a while, and then he left.
Yeah,
and
Kay.
What did he do after that? Do you know?
Kay came in the late 70s, and he was one who went off and started a lot of business ventures for Ionics overseas. And Libya, as I remember, he did the Spanish Canary Islands seawater RO plant. He did put Ionics into a lot of businesses, that some of which flourished and some of which didn't.
He did. He was there for
He left, I guess, the mid-90s.
Yeah, but the big Dora refinery job in Iraq.
That's one that you sold.
Well, I had some involvement, but Kevin McElhaney was instrumental in that. But that was, I think that was $90 million. It was one of the largest single contracts that Ionics ever had, and it was because of Kay, I'm sure. Another one that I remember was a job in Libya where we had a turnkey job that was like $10 million. I think the estimated total cost was $5 million, but it consisted of 3 complete plants out in the desert near the Egyptian border. It was actually for the Libyan army. And the only thing that existed at the site was wells that had been drilled. And the contract included providing everything else, so we had to go out and set up camp to live off of. We built tanks, a power plant, EDR plant.
For your own use. Gene, have you got a final story you'd like to share with us?
One person you need to also try to see again would be a fellow named Ed Geishecker.
Ed was supposed to be here today.
Ed was my boss, and he was the national sales manager for Ionics, and he was the one. We always joked and said, Ed, the Sarasota plant ought to have the Ed Geishecker Memorial Building plaque on it, because Ed spent 18 months almost full-time to get that job.
Yeah.
And then the membrane stacks were all finished, and the plant was going to be a year late, but the building was going to be a year late being put up, and we inventoried everything that we built. And Geishecker was the one who did a lot of the work in the United States to help build Ionics. And
Right.
I was his first outside salesperson, me in California, and Ed back in Boston. If you can later get the opportunity to talk to Bill Katz, I understand he's out in California right now.
Right.
Bill must be about 87, so try to hurry up and get him while you can, because he's probably the person more than anybody else who built Ionics in the early days.
Yeah, I think
Ionics
so.
never would have survived without Bill Katz and his drive. Man is a genius. I saw him at Santa Barbara. He took on protesters to the seawater desalting plant because people thought we were going to poison them, and yada, yada, yada. And he took on the media, and he was a marvel. He could work wonders with the city council, with the media, with local people. He just was a marvel. And I remember, Bill was in his early 70s at Ionics, and he climbed up on top of bulldozers at the job site to get a better viewpoint of the job. So he had the energy level of somebody 35 years old in his early 70s.
I can remember sitting with him in meetings, in Sarasota, as a matter of fact. And you remember he used to carry that little circular slide rule
in his pocket. He'd pull it out and whip it around.
And he'd be sitting there, and he'd be wearing his glasses. And
he'd put him up on his glasses,
put him up on his forehead and get that thing out and said, well, I think it'll probably be about 38 cents a gallon or something like that.
Yes.
He's a good guy. So again, I want to thank you all very much for being here, and I've enjoyed talking with you.
Nice seeing you again.
Thanks. It was good to be here. Ian.
Enjoy your retirement and your furniture making.
Oh, yes. If you need anything, let me know.
I will.
Thank you.
Thank you.